This week on Capitol Journal's Week in Review, the Alabama legislature was back in action with the first bills passing through the House and Senate. We'll tell you what happened and what's next. State Finance Director Bill Poole discusses the governor's budget, plus the latest with the prison construction plan. House Minority Leader Anthony Daniels talks about his caucus's priorities and what we can expect after the spring break. And Capitol Press Corps reporters Brian Lyman and Erin Davis are in studio for a panel discussion about the week that was in the legislature. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. It was a busy week in the legislature as the House and Senate met Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in their respective chambers, with a host of committee meetings taking place as well. Our coverage starts in the House, where a number of priority bills were moving, including a plan to crack down on fentanyl trafficking and reforms to the state's adoption procedures. Capitol Journal's Randy Scott reports.
The special session done, House members are back at work covering bills such as House Bill 9, dealing with good time rules for state prisoners.
A Class 1 inmate who is the lowest level offender can earn 75 days. For every 30 days that they're well behaved and good, we give them 75 days. This bill would change that to more for a day by day, that if they're behaved and earn 30 days, very fair enough, we will give them 30 days.
So if we're creating a prison population that is unmanageable, that's not corrected, that will still get out at some point, we can't ensure the people that we owe this duty to that we can protect them effectively. So our system is absolutely broken.
House Bill 9 was approved and has support from state law enforcement officials, especially the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, who say they lost one of their own to violence.
I appreciate the work they're doing and the work they've discussed about trying to fix the correctional system as it stands now. I understand the challenges that the state faces with that, but with that we still have to do our job and they have to do their job.
What happened, to me and Deputy Johnson was a horrifying experience, but we're going to get through it and we're going to save the lives of many others through seeing this legislative pass.
Lawmakers deal with House Bill 1, addressing tougher laws to fight the drug fentanyl.
House Bill 1 is a bill that will put mandatory minimum sentences on those that are convicted of trafficking fentanyl. This bill has been, with the focus of this bill is to focus on the drug dealers and the drug traffickers.
House Bill 1 passes on a 105-0 vote. House Bill 101 addresses changes to Alabama's adoption codes.
HB 101 is a total replacement of the Alabama Adoption Code with two separate codes, the Alabama Minor Adoption Code and the Alabama Adult Adoption Code.
Some of this legislation we pass on through the years, I'm not seeing where it's necessarily streamlined the process. So hopefully this will be one such piece of legislation that it will do just as, we've said it would do.
House Bill 101 was approved. For Capitol Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
About that good time prison incentive proposal, the Senate took action on that this week as well. Senate Bill 1 from Senator April Weaver advanced through committee and then passed on the Senate floor by a vote of 30-1. Family and colleagues of Deputy Brad Johnson, for whom the bill is named, were on hand to witness its passage.
On behalf of Deputy Brad Johnson and his friends and family, I thank my colleagues for this today. Deputy Poole, we're glad that you can be here with us. We appreciate you and wish you well in your recovery, and hopefully by this step that we've taken today, we've made safer communities for all of the state of Alabama, and that you and your colleagues will never have to go through things like this again. And thank you for all that you've done to help get this bill passed.
The one dissenting vote was State Senator Bobby Singleton, who argued that Weaver's bill goes too far. He negotiated an amendment that would ensure those simply defending themselves or involved in peaceful protest aren't unfairly punished. I spoke with Senator Singleton yesterday after the bill passed, and he said he still has concerns about the bill's impact.
Right now, you can get, for every 30 days, you will get 75 days of good time law. And so that's a start in category 1. And hers will be a 30 for 30. And one of the biggest things that I thought that this bill, in terms of having unintended consequences, that we're currently under a federal court order right now for overcrowdedness. Her bill right now, by taking it away from the inmates, will add another 810 days to a 10-year sentence when you just started looking at the sentences. I made an offer to her to look at, for every 30 days, we'll do 60 days. We'll give 60 instead of 75. And when you look at the reduction of my bill, a person will only stay in jail on that same 10-year sentence only 241 more days. And I think that that's much more palatable to what the federal government would look at. I just don't know how they're going to look at it in terms of our overcrowdedness, whether or not they would take that in consideration and say, hey, maybe they're trying to do something to streamline this, but at the end of the day, we're causing people to stay inside the prison system much more longer.
So you're saying by going with the bill as written, it would be a signal to DOJ / the courts,
yes,
that perhaps, wait, they're not doing what we asked them to do
yes,
in terms of prison population.
And I'm afraid of that.
The Senate also passed Senate Bill 113 from Senator Garland Gudger. The bill would require healthcare facilities, including hospitals and nursing homes, to allow in-person visits in several scenarios, such as end of life, during childbirth, and for pediatric patients. During floor debate, State Senator Marika Coleman of Birmingham sought some clarification on if the bill would allow facilities to protect patients from visitors who may have a contagious condition.
If I had gone into that hospital carrying something and he be exposed to something that I have, in this particular situation, COVID, how are we going to ensure that the visitors coming in don't further expose the people that we just really want to be there to help and support?
If there's noticeably somebody that comes into the hospital as a visitor and needs to be checked for whether that's COVID or flu or anything, and you don't want that particular visitor to go into a patient's room and infect other people and that patient, especially if you're looking like at a cancer patient with low white blood cells or something like that, then through the hospital's procedures and policies that they have put in this bill, they are able to test anybody that comes in. If the doctor deems that this particular patient doesn't need to have visitors, for example, church groups, the general population come and visit, that doctors can still have the authority to not allow visitors in that room except for one essential caregiver at least once a day for 2 hours minimum, and if there is visiting hours.
Away from the chamber, Senate Democrats sought to bring attention to the issue of abortion, and specifically Alabama's 2019 strict abortion ban that, thanks to last year's Supreme Court decision, is in full effect. State Senator Vivian Davis Figures introduced 2 bills rolling back that law. While she's aware they aren't likely to move in a Republican legislature, she wants to re-engage the conversation about abortion rights. Karen Goldsmith has that story.
In Alabama, abortion is illegal unless the pregnancy is a threat to the mother's health. State Senator Vivian Davis Figures wants to repeal that law or also allow abortion if the pregnancy is the result of rape or incest.
There is no law in the United States of America that mandates what a man can or cannot do with his own body. God gives us all free will, but Alabama has even taken that away from women.
State Senator Clyde Chambliss sponsored the near-total abortion ban. We requested his thoughts on Senator Figures' efforts.
Well, I have not seen those bills yet, so I'll review those and read those and then have an opinion. I have not seen them yet. So.
The bill's co-sponsors shared their thoughts on Alabama's current abortion stance.
Laws without morals are simply useless. And what we are faced with is quite often we're legislating dislikes and prejudices and all kinds of things that have nothing to do with what it means to set some sort of a standard that says every life matters to the extent that we will not legislate, first of all, a woman's body.
Aaliyah reported 1,890 rape cases. This is the latest data. 79% know they're rapists. 23% were between the ages of 13 and 16. In Alabama, rape has increased 30% over the last 30 years.
This bill is a messaging bill, but most bills start with a message. And this is a message that we will not take this line down, that we want to ensure that there is gender justice for future generations and currently.
For my colleagues who say that they are pro-life, if you are pro-life, that means you're pro-social services for those children once they get here, adequately educating them once they get here, in addition to making sure that their parents are gainfully employed once they get here. And if you're not for that, then that just means you're pro-birth. You're not pro-life.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
The legislature has now completed 4 of the 30 legislative days allowed by the Constitution. They'll now take their scheduled spring break next week and return on April 4th. Senate President Pro Tem Greg Reed offered a preview of what's to come after the break. He said the focus will be passing the updated economic development incentive bills.
We've worked diligently on that process. The governor is very much engaged. I've talked with the speaker, many of my members. Alabama has benefited tremendously from the incentives. We want them to be renewed. The process of renewal is one now. It's going to be expanded. I think you're looking at a 4-bill package that's going to be introduced that's going to focus on several different areas of site development, as well as renewal of the Jobs Act, transparency topics, ideas of being able to move things forward in a way that draws industry, manufacturers, big business to the state of Alabama, but also you've got an element in this that's focused on Innovate Alabama, which has been very important to me, focused on small businesses, startup businesses, entrepreneurial growth, being able to find ways to help businesses that are small, just getting started, that hopefully one day will be big businesses that are going to employ thousands of Alabamians.
We'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capitol Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capitol Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capitol Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capitol Journal.
Joining me next is State Finance Director Bill Poole. Mr. Poole, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Big week for you. Governor Ivey unveiled her budgets. It may require some explaining. We've been at session for 2 weeks. It was a special session.
Right.
This week was the second day of the regular session. That's when she's required to submit her budgets. But it's your job to sort of explain to the press and maybe members too what's all in these budgets. So I was hoping you could sort of walk us through some of the high points in her proposed budgets. Maybe we can start with the general fund.
Sure. Well, the governor's excited about these budgets, and I am as well. So certainly glad to summarize those, and we look forward to the legislative process ahead. We've had a lot of meetings with legislators and leadership regarding what are some priorities from that side of the street. So excited to get that process started. But there are 3 critical themes, I think, that move throughout all of the budgets. One is to make strategic, responsible, and sustainable a key term for us and a key kind of guiding point. Sustainable investments that will pay returns for an extended period of time, not just a fleeting investment, but one that will create returns in both the general fund and the education budget. 2 is to do what any family or business does when they have a little extra funding, pay down debt. And 3, put some aside for savings. So that's the goal through both of these budgets. Smart investments, reduce debt, put some in savings for a rainy day. So to start with the general fund, it's a very positive budget. We've made sustainable investments as it relates to a variety of the agencies. Particularly, though, some of the larger investments were required in Medicaid. Medicaid was approximately a $70 million increase. That's really driven by the wind down of some federal pandemic funding. The feds provided supplemental Medicaid funding that allowed the state to reduce its obligations. Those obligations are coming back on the books. So we want to make sure we're in a position to sustain the Medicaid program as required by law. In the Department of Corrections, about $58 million new dollars. That's primarily a new health care contract. The old contract rolled off. A new competitive bid process yielded a new contract. There's some other safety and correctional type of investments. For instance, a cell phone interdiction technology system to control cell phone usage, so on and so forth. So some targeted investments. There's a 2% pay raise in the governor's proposed budget for all state employees. That helps us from a recruitment and a retain state employees, particularly for some of our harder to fill positions.
Well, I was going to ask that $58 million for corrections, is that part of their pay raise, their special pay raise they're offering?
That is not part of it. That's funded through the pay raise allocation in the bill. So that will pass through to them. But it's important, though. It's a very tight labor market. Everybody's having trouble finding good help. That's true for state government as well. So to be competitive, recruit, and retain, particularly here again in hard to fill positions, is important. So some targeted inflationary investments in our agencies. For instance, Aaliyah has troopers over the road. They've seen gas usage prices go up. All agencies, like every home and every business, have been impacted by inflation, unfortunately. So there are increased costs. So some investments we believe that are responsible, sustainable, will create a return as it relates to the services provided for our citizens. And here again, though, in the general fund, a substantial allocation to debt reduction and a substantial allocation to increase our rainy day fund, recognizing that economic difficulties may be on the horizon.
I think I saw $50 million set aside for the general fund rolling reserve.
That's correct.
Let me ask you, because there was projected to be about a 20% surplus in the general fund. Did inflation and extra costs eat up all of that, or will there be some left over?
Well, out of the carry forward funds, we've allocated most of that to reserve and debt reduction.
Okay.
So there's some other targeted investments, but we have $50 million for reserve funds and almost $50 million in debt reduction. So that was almost $100 million of the general fund carry forward. And so we felt very comfortable with that. Both of those protect and stabilize future budgets, but they also don't bring on new obligations, right? So it helps you on both sides of that equation.
Well, it's like you said, it's not something flashy. It's not a new program or buying some new equipment that everybody can get excited about, debt reduction, but it's a fiscally necessary thing to do.
That's right. That's right.
Moving on to the Education Trust Fund, what were some of the high points? This is the one that had a $2.7, almost $2.8 billion surplus, kind of unheard of. So a lot of people were excited to see where those go in the supplementals. But walk me through some of the high points.
So it is a historic carry forward amount. I mean, by any margin, we've never seen anything like it. But we know it's not sustainable. So here again, I keep using the word sustainable, but we know that surplus is not sustainable. We know it's driven by a lot of anomalies in the federal, whether it's federal spending, whether it's inflation that's having an impact on receipts, a lot of things that we know are not going to sustain. So trying to here again find sustainable investments, pay down debt again in the ETF, set aside reserve in the ETF. But on the education side, a 2% pay raise for teachers. Here again, we need to make sure we can recruit and retain teachers. There are a lot of career paths for smart, bright, young folks these days. And we need to make sure education is a viable path that compensates them for their talents. We have a teacher shortage and a tight labor market. We have increased investments in pre-K, particularly going to focus on our challenged areas around the state where we know we need to improve some education outcomes. A lot of K-12 investment, speaking of education outcomes, targeting early grades, particularly literacy and numeracy. The legislature, the governor's leadership involved as well, has in recent years passed the Literacy Act, which is really a watershed moment, I think. Now, we've had the pandemic. It has slowed implementation, but we're making sure that that is fully funded. We can begin to see early grade literacy gains. We think we're starting to see that a little bit. We want to see those trends continue. Numeracy. The legislature more recently passed the Numeracy Act. We have $40 million for math coaches and otherwise to support the numeracy effort. Reading and arithmetic. I mean, those are the fundamentals, and if we can improve that in the early grades, we know we can improve outcomes in the later grades. So those were critical investments on the education side, after schools and summer learning. Flex money, so to speak, for the districts. We call that other current expenses, but that's really funds that the districts have some flexibility over, some transportation support funding. So a lot of targeted investments in K-12 where we either had needs, wanted to build on success, or really wanted to laser in on some fundamentals.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the tax rebates, because that comes from the supplemental on Educate from the ETF, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's some of this surplus
That's
money.
correct.
$400 a piece, basically, to anybody who has filed taxes. That's on the individual side. On the total comes up to about $966.7 million, almost $1 billion in tax rebates. It's part of the. She said it in her State of the State. Now we're having more details on it. Walk me through y'all's conversations on where exactly to put that number, because we saw like kind of a menu from Senator Orr about, okay, if it's $200 it costs this much, if it's $800 it costs this much. Did y'all find your Goldilocks kind of place?
We observed the same menu, so to speak, and we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we help the citizens of our state in a responsible fashion. So inflation here again has impacted families. Other economic issues have impacted families. It was important to the governor that the rebate be meaningful enough to help a working family. And at $400 per filer in a household with two parents, that means you're going to have $800 in the household. So it was important that the amount be sufficient enough to have a meaningful impact to help Alabama's families and individuals who are working and contributing to this historic surplus. This amount is only approximately a little less than a third of the total carry forward. So we thought this was responsible and sustainable. And as we talked about a lot with the rebate, we thought about what would we do if we were a business? What business principles can we apply? Well, you typically give bonuses to your employees. In this case, we're going to give propose giving rebates back to our citizens for their utilization as they see fit. We've made strategic investments, and we've set aside to pay down debt and plus up our savings. I mean, I think that's what any responsible household would do, any responsible business would do. We wanted to apply those principles to this issue.
I have heard some pushback in this building from rank and file lawmakers, including Republicans, who kind of challenged that idea that kind of like you were talking about in terms of the budget principles, not spending money on one-time fun things, but rather investments that are sustainable, saving money. Some members see this as one-time money, perhaps not spent in the most responsible way. One-time rebate versus putting all that money aside and finding some other use for it. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard some of that criticism too. How do you respond to that?
Well, the proposal will move through the legislative process now, and so we'll see a lot of new ideas enter the equation. And I think Governor Ivey would be the first to tell you we're open to any ideas, but we believe that this was responsible and a way to help working families right now. I mean, these are excess dollars. These are cash on hand. So there's a couple ways, I think, in the spectrum of the decisions that you can decide. On one hand, we can take the position that government, we should spend it all. Okay. On the other hand, we could take the position of, some kind of permanent tax reductions. Somewhere in the middle, recognizing these are one-time funds, they're likely not to recur. There's some economic anomalies that are creating this situation. You make a one-time rebate allocation back to the citizens. We're seeing a lot of states do the same thing. I think Georgia just passed theirs or announced their rebate proposal. Mm-hmm. So there's a spectrum of proposals. All of those ideas are fair. All are reasonable and subject to discussion and debate. We look forward to working with the legislature on all of those ideas. We're open to anything. But it was important to the governor to take a position of what she believed would help our citizens right now.
Sure. Be interesting to watch that in the legislative process, because you're right, and you know better than anybody how messy that can get. Mm-hmm. Switching gears, I want to talk about prisons. Last week we learned that the amount that the state will be authorized to spend by the prison authority, Prison Finance Authority, increased by a lot, more than $300 million on this one prison in Elmore County. A little sticker shock on that, I think, from a lot of people who didn't see that coming. Can you explain? We heard the word inflation. Senator Albritton used that, and you did too. Can you kind of explain why the cost increase, just from what y'all decided as an authority?
Sure. Well, the state is facing a lot of challenges as we construct these prisons. And again, I want to stop and really give a lot of credit to the governor and the legislature for being willing to take on this very, very challenging and difficult issue. We know we have to do something. We have to have new facilities. Now, we're constructing those in a challenging environment at this point with inflation and other factors, and we have a lot of conditions and circumstances that are working against us, but we're committed to build them. There's really no choice. The state has to move forward, and we're going to do that. But a couple of the circumstances are, since the bill was passed and the proposal, we're seeing record inflation. Now, our professional consultants built in inflationary aspects, but didn't anticipate in those early proposals the level of inflation that's impacting construction costs in any industry, whether it's home building, commercial building, or in this case, an enormous capital project in the form of a 4,000-bed men's prison. And then I want to stop and say that again. 4,000-bed men's prison. That is a very substantial project.
And not a dormitory. Yeah.
That's right. And so you've touched on one of the designs. So we also, those original estimates were based upon some very preliminary designs that had not been, the prison facility had not been fully designed. As those designs have matured, costs have increased. For instance, to comply with court orders, we need to have a greater cell to dorm ratio. Right now we have most of our inmates in a dorm type of setting. Court orders are requiring us to move those into a more cellular type setting for all the obvious reasons from a safety standpoint, but that costs a lot more. We've also decided to invest more fairly substantially in the vocational, rehabilitational, educational spaces. We think it'd be a poor investment for the state to build these facilities and not have first-class rehabilitation, vocational type facilities.
Which is what that Elmore place is for.
That's right. So there parts of the project we've had to enhance, parts we're responding to court orders, parts we're dealing with inflation. So there have been a lot of challenges. At this point, we'll know the final cost for the Elmore facility this summer. Our professional consultants, the department's doing everything we can to contain costs, but the costs have increased. For this, as it's really increased when you go to the grocery store or you build a home, it's just unfortunately the facts and the circumstances that we face.
Understand. And so a true cynic, not saying I am one, but a true cynic would say, when I hear you say, we have to do this, we have no choice but to build these prisons, well, doesn't that put the construction company or whomever else an advantage to say, well, we can charge whatever we want, they're going to pay it anyway because they're in a corner?
Well, feasibly, and I understand your point, I think the point I would respond is we have a law that says we have to build them.
Yes, true. Yeah.
So
legislature did pass a law.
We have a law, so we can't build a facility that has 3,700 beds.
So I guess
it
maybe
has to
that's
have
a better
4,000.
question. Maybe that's a better question. How do you contain costs when you are in a corner?
Well, you create competition through your bid processes. So the reason that the ASIFA, the authority that oversees this construction, increased its spending authority is we have a couple of the big work packages. So your subcontractors coming in and undertaking major parts of the construction package. The more competition you have in those bid processes, the more advantageous your prices are going to be. So that's what is about to occur. We're about to have a couple of the major bid packages are going to go out for a competitive public bid. As those prices come back, we're going to be able to have a greater idea of what the final price is going to be. But that is also the challenging component of doing this is you're going through this process, you're placing them out for public bid. You open the envelope, and those are the bids you receive. And you have some limited choices upon receipt of those bids. So we're working through it. We know how significant this is from a cost standpoint. We know how significant it is from the future of the state standpoint, from the securing of our criminal justice system. I mean, this is important for law enforcement, for our court system, for our correction system. The impact of this will ripple through our whole state from a public safety standpoint. We have to make progress in our correction system. And there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed. A lot of those cannot be addressed in our current facilities that are just in they're just in terrible condition. Yeah. We've got to put some new facilities online. We need the efficiencies those will bring. We need to close some old facilities and realize those efficiencies. Those cost savings we hope will catch up with us over time, but we're going to have to deal with the upfront capital costs.
Something to follow going forward. State Finance Director Bill Poole, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Joining me next is State Representative Anthony Daniels of Huntsville, Minority Leader for the Alabama House of Representatives. Mr. Leader, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me again, Todd. It's always fun to be with you.
Well, here we are through the first real week of the regular session. We've had those 2 weeks of special. There was a busy State House this week. 3-day week legislatively, a lot of action in committees. Y'all finally got to the floor to consider legislation. From your perspective as Minority Leader, how pleased are you with the pace of the session so far?
I think so far so good. You know, dealing with the fentanyl bill and dealing with the adoption bill, making it easier for adoption, and so focusing on two very important issues. We've seen since COVID, we've seen a significant increase in the need for adoptions. As a result of COVID, and so addressing those particular issues and making it easier process and expanding the process, I think is a good bill. The fentanyl bill, I think it's a good bill. The great conversation around substance abuse and really the need for substance abuse and getting commitments for using dollars to really make investments in substance abuse and addiction. And so for us, I think it's a pretty good. We're on a great pace, and hopefully that continues. I know that we'll be forecasting. We'll be dealing with the growing Alabama and other things that are certainly other wins for the state of Alabama, and having budgetary conversations about where we are and where we need to be and what investments we need to make. And so it's going to be a really good year. The first half of the year is going to be good.
Well, and we'll get to some of that budget stuff in a minute, but I wanted to touch on fentanyl. You brought it up. So this bill really starts becoming bipartisan, which is kind of rare for criminal justice bills, but I think that's maybe a reflection of just how this is a problem in every community. Law enforcement is saying they're having a real hard time combating the issue of fentanyl. And this deals with trafficking, cracking down on trafficking. But there's also a conversation about, okay, alongside stiffer penalties, needs to be more of a focus on treatment for those who are truly addicted to this. Do you think there's a capacity for that with the current funds we have?
I do. I also think that with the settlement dollars from the opioid settlement dollars, there may be an opportunity to really leverage those funds to further focus on addiction and substance abuse. And so that's something that we fully anticipate. But we can't afford not to do anything. And right now, it's a problem in all communities. It doesn't have an income level to the community that's impacted by this. I was reading a text message a friend sent me on yesterday, telling me about a 38-year-old that have overdosed because what product that they had some fentanyl in it, and that young person lost his life. And so, though when you hear stories like that, you become very concerned. And this issue has been an issue plaguing our communities across the country. It's a nationwide issue. But I'm very, very happy that Alabama, in the state of Alabama, we're deciding to address that issue on the front end.
House Bill 1, that speaks to its priority, right, in the House. Well, let's go to those budget issues, because the governor introduces her budget this week, which is constitutionally required. She's got to do it. I remember back in the old days when it was a divided, like Republican governor, Democratic legislature, they basically just throw it in the trash and start over. Nowadays, it's more cohesive between the legislature and the executive branch, but there's still going to be significant changes, probably in the legislature to what has been introduced. I think everybody understands that. But the issue of tax rebates, I've been hearing some pushback on this a little bit from Republicans and Democrats, almost juxtaposed to the idea of a grocery tax repeal, right? Getting rid of the sales tax on groceries. And it's not, they're not mutually exclusive or anything like that. But I am hearing more and more of this idea of grocery tax as permanent and more applying to everybody rather than just those that file taxes. What are you hearing within your caucus?
Oh, absolutely. There's also a slight difference in opinion on what this grocery tax should look like. We're more interested in supportive of the SNAP definition. There's already a precedence for that, a baseline for that. It would not require local businesses and grocery stores to be able to change their system because they already have a system in place where when they're accepting SNAP benefits, the formula is already in place, and so we feel
when you scan it, the system knows this is SNAP and this
absolutely.
is not. Yeah.
So from an infrastructure standpoint, wouldn't require any additional purchasing or investments in those grocery stores to make those investments. And so I think for me, I like to see more the SNAP definition than the WIC definition. I know that the WIC definition is been also being considered a bill being dropped on using the WIC definition. But also for me, I think that we've had conversations long enough. I do think that there's an appetite to move on that. And so for me, those that may still believe that it'll be a significant hit, let's try out the proposal that Representative McClammy and Senator Jones are working on that will create holidays, grocery tax holidays, month-long holidays, say a June and a December, so that we can then use FY 22, 21, and go back to 20 to be able to compare and contrast the revenue brought in, our tax receipts from those particular months to this year in 23 versus those other months in the previous years to see where we are and as it relates to budgetary wise.
Because that's always been, I mean, look, they would have done this 20 years ago, except for the fact that these sales taxes go to the Education Trust Fund. And so any hit to the Education Trust Fund is problematic for a lot of reasons, especially for folks taking the vote, right? So that's the idea. If you, let's prove it. Let's see exactly what happens via a holiday, and that's not permanent policy, so you can still kind of be flexible, I guess.
Absolutely, and it'll let you know whether or not your theory is correct. My theory is, hey, they're saving money at the grocery store, but there are some items that will still be taxed within that grocery store, so you'll still collect some taxes there. But if they decide you'll get some of those dollars back on sales tax and other items outside of the grocery store and within the grocery store. And so whether it's retail, whether it's online taxes, and so just being able to look at our tax receipts and see, if in fact, are we getting more money? Are we losing money? If so, what does that amount look like? And so that way we'll get a real forecast of the impact that this will have on our budgets long term.
As my old economics professor would say, it all comes out in the wash. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I see you've got a green folder over here, and that means you're preparing to introduce a bill, and I'm assuming that this is your long-awaited bill on overtime income taxes. You want to basically repeal that. Is that correct?
That's correct. I would like to repeal the taxes that the state of Alabama collects for overtime so that those dollars will go back to the actual individual employee. Right now, the state of Alabama, a 5% tax rate, about 5%, where on overtime that's time and a half. So if you're making $20 an hour, there's a tax, that's 5% income tax already on the $20 an hour. But at time and a half, 5% is a lot heavier hit to you when you're working time and a half, and it's not encouraging folks to work overtime. But eliminating the tax on overtime pay, that means that 5% that you eliminate on the time and a half goes back to the employee. What it does it helps the employee with the rate of inflation, what we're dealing with right now, the high cost of grocery stores and the high costs in general. It gives them more spending power to be able to still provide for their families. But for an employer, it gives them the opportunity to be able to increase productivity.
They're going to have more employees choosing to work overtime because they get more money.
Absolutely, and they'll be able to produce more. So if I have a manufacturer that's that's putting together bottles, and in order for me to be able to meet the productivity schedule that I have in place, I need 100 employees. But this overtime tax will encourage the 80 employees that I currently have to work overtime, maybe 10 hours of overtime a week, right? So then at that point, their 80 employees will be able to produce at the rate of 100. So I'll be at or above schedule. So it increases productivity. reduces the need for as more additional employees during the time, I think it'll also increase the labor participation rate, because they see the incentive to be able to make more money and bring home more money. And this is just something that we have to do as a state and doing our due diligence. But you'll see local communities will see these dollars back because of the spending behavior, the consumer behavior on spending. Working class people are going to spend the additional money that they're getting. So local municipalities and county governments will benefit the most, but don't have to make any investments in it. And so the state is taking the hit in order to help the local and county municipalities, as well as the state will recoup some in sales tax as well.
It's interesting. It almost sounds like one of those almost rare policies that the business community and labor unions would probably be in favor of.
Absolutely. This is a way to bring them together. And I think it brings all Alabamians together, and it rewards hard work.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, it's a brand new proposal. As in my mind, I can't remember one like it in years past. How have your conversations gone with your colleagues on either side of the aisle about, you've got to build support for something like this?
Absolutely. And so, unfortunately, I've not had to necessarily reach out to a lot of people about this. They've been reading about it. You guys have done a great job of putting the idea out there. Others have been doing a great job of putting the idea out there. And so we certainly appreciate you guys' involvement in this process. But what it has done is it has forced constituents of our members to be able to communicate with them and voicing their interest in this issue. I had a representative that tell me, he said, Anthony, man, my constituents are calling me every day about this eliminating overtime tax. When are you going to drop that bill? I said, I want to drop it soon. And so I have a number of co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, from a leadership perspective, for just even freshman members that have talked to me about it, that's shown interest in wanting to co-sponsor the bill. And so, I'm excited about it and looking forward to being able to get it on the House floor after our break.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll certainly be tracking this. And we're out of time today, but I want to have you back to talk. You mentioned the whole workforce participation thing. I really think that's going to be a huge conversation, not just in this session, but moving forward. Because I think every time the unemployment rate comes out, people are like, wait, but let's look at that workforce participation. So any proposal that takes aim at that, I think, is going to be worth looking at. But again, Minority Leader Anthony Daniels, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Joining me next for a reporter roundtable are Brian Lyman of the Alabama Reflector and Erin Davis of WSFA and Gray Television. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a good time to sort of wrap up the week, this first real week of legislative session, or at least the regular session, after 2 weeks of special session dealing with ARPA. And now we break for spring break. So let me just ask you, I'll start with you, Brian. What were some of your big takeaways from this first full week of the regular?
It still really feels like we are in a very tentative period with this legislature. We have new leadership. We have a lot of new members. There's not a sense of, I guess, a driving priority from the top going down. I mean, certainly the House prioritized this fentanyl bill, creating new mandatory minimums there, but you don't get a sense that there's like a real program that's going on this year, which is very different from other years. This could be good, or this you could take your pick as to like whether this is good or bad. Certainly like there could be more unusual pieces of legislation to come out. On the other hand, we're actually having some very serious talks about repealing the grocery tax. Now, we had a discussion about Medicaid expansion, which was not shouted down instantly this week. To my mind, it still feels like a session that's really trying to figure out what it's all about.
Erin, he mentioned fentanyl, and I know you've covered this extensively in the House. They passed that, House Bill 1, obviously a top priority. what were your observations? I mean, it was unanimous, right?
Yeah, it was a unanimous vote, which I think Representative Jackson had even said the first time he'd seen 105 yes votes in that chamber.
Wow.
He was in awe. I was in awe. Even when the bill was in committee, you know, Representative England seconded the vote, or gave a second so the bill could pass through that committee. So it was really interesting to see them all kind of unified against this drug, because we know it's deadly, but just seeing them all on the same page is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that was my observation as well, because most times when you go to Judiciary Committee, especially a tough on crime, any kind of penalties bill, you know, Chris England will, like, you're just waiting for him to pounce, to say, no, we're gonna scale this back, but he didn't. And it was some interesting conversation about, okay, we're going to talk about treatment. We're going to also talk about taking care of addiction and all that, and using some of this opioid money. So that was interesting. Let's talk about the budget. The governor introduced her budget per the Constitution this week. It's kind of the starting point. We know they're not going to pass exactly what she proposed, but the big thing was tax rebates, right? Using $1 billion, or about $1 billion of this surplus money to give everybody between $400 and $800 in a tax rebate check. Everybody likes money. Everybody would like to get a check, but I'm actually starting to hear pushback, even from Republicans, about maybe that's not what they want to do with this surplus. What are you hearing?
There has been more serious talk about repealing the grocery tax this year than I would say in the last 10 years, maybe even the last 15 years. You and I were around in 2008 when the Alabama House of Representatives accidentally repealed the grocery sales tax, and it came within a few votes. It came within a whisker of passing in the Senate before some personal feud ended up dooming it. I get the sense that there is more movement to do the grocery tax this year. Whether that comes about, I don't know. Like, that will all depend on your education budget chairs. The grocery tax repeal would cost, if you were to repeal the whole thing, it's about $608 million, according to the LFO. The tax rebates, as Governor Ivey has budgeted them, would be about $1 billion. But the key difference is the grocery tax repeal would be a permanent repeal of those taxes. The tax rebates would be a one-time thing where that money hopefully would come back next year. I am hearing more especially from Republicans, that there's more willingness to do this grocery tax just because it is so unpopular, it is so harmful, it is so awful, like especially in an era of inflation. But really, like, we'll just have to see how leaders really think that's possible.
Yeah, Erin, it's interesting because, you know, tax rebate would be one-time money. Grocery tax repeal would be in perpetuity, saving money every year. Maybe not as much up front, but, you know, everybody pays tax at the grocery store. Yeah. So are you hearing that the same thing in terms of your reporting? Do you see it as feasible that we might get to a grocery tax?
I think so. I've even seen, you know, the lieutenant governor posting on Twitter that he met with the Grocers Association talking about cutting that grocery tax. You know, House Democrats, this is always a priority for them. And then when I do my reporting, I try to talk to, you know, people in the grocery store. And like Brian said, it's extremely unpopular. People really want to have that tax cut, especially to save money on things essentials, basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say unpopular, because on the flip side of that, it would actually be very popular to go back home as a politician and say, hey, guess what? I cut your taxes on groceries, or I repealed it. So I think everybody would probably like to do it. It's just a matter of revenue, right? That's always been the thing.
Yeah.
You know, like you said, $600-800 million from the Education Trust Fund. So, I mean, even when Democrats were in charge back then, they weren't going to touch the Education Trust Fund. So it's a matter of finding the revenue to replace it, or being comfortable, I guess, with a reduction in revenue.
It's a real indictment of this state's tax system that we depend on taxing people's essentials to keep our schools running. That is, to me, like that says that is a damning statement about how we assess taxes in this state.
Moving on to the issue of good time. This was, this is prison policy, incentives for inmates to behave well and act well, not act up in prison. It's important because it's a way to make prisons less dangerous. Obviously, we know we have very dangerous prisons. So there's this reform that Senator April Weaver has in the Senate. Rex Reynolds, I think, has it, or
Russell Bedsole.
Russell Bedsole has it in the House. scaling back some of that good time. It passed, but not without an amendment from Senator Singleton. Do you see this as passing through the House as it is, or do you think there will be more amendments as it goes down to the House? Erin, I'll start with you.
Well, I was not in the Senate chamber that day, so I don't know what that amendment was, but I can see there at least being a lot more debate around it, and possibly an amendment. When the bill was in committee, to kind of backtrack, we know Albritton brought up an amendment to kind of set this bill back a little bit until the ADOC could have enough beds to, for people that would basically end up being incarcerated from the bill. So moving forward, I could see some amendments possibly, brought up, but who knows if they'll be added.
I agree with Erin. I think when you see something that has the support from law enforcement, and this certainly brought out, like in the House committee, it brought out many law enforcement officials on Wednesday, it's often very hard for the legislature to resist that momentum. This bill, as I think we all know, and its origin was the shooting death of this deputy in Bibb County, which was like an awful tragedy. The person arrested in this shooting should never have been out of prison in the first place. I think that the issue here, though, is that tragedy is being used to justify this bill. I'm not sure if this bill was in place, if this law was in place at the time, that would have done anything in this situation, because this person, this suspect who is accused in this crime, his good time should have been revoked instantly. He should never have been put out under prison. And as far as I know, there's nothing under current law that would have prevented that revocation from taking place. Other thing too is we have 20,000 people in Alabama prisons. That is roughly the equivalent of the city of Anniston, the city of Foley, the city of Pritchard. Corrections 101 is the way you manage a violent prison, like a violent group of offenders, is either like you give them something to work toward, or you give them a privilege that can be revoked if they misbehave. If you cut the good time incentives for these inmates, you're taking away one of those things that can be used as a tool to maintain order in those prisons. This may end up not mattering to legislators. They may pass it anyway, but considering the situation in our prisons, this is not going to help managing the violence or any of the other awful things that we are seeing in our correctional facilities.
Yeah, and my observation was that, because you make a good point about would this actually have mattered. Yeah, tough to say. I think what it did was it forced them to start looking at the policy and seeing some things they didn't like. One of them being people not being able to revoke good time, right? Like if you try to escape, there should also be a disincentive on for bad behavior and all that. So I'm interested to see as it goes to the House whether there will be some more amendments, because that amendment was significant. I mean, she was looking for basically a day for a day on good time. It's scaled back to I think 60 days for every 30 days. So like that's a pretty significant amendment. And also the governor's office. I made this point to Senator Singleton. Like, look, they're in charge of the prisons, and they obviously have an opinion on this policy. So there could always be an executive amendment. So that's something to watch. But it's interesting on prison policy. I mean, in terms of politics, it's never a bad bet to go tough on crime, right? But it's the minutia. Sometimes it's really gets overlooked.
I mean, this is what drives people in corrections crazy, because we create these crimes, we create these sentences, and the folks who create them don't think about like what do you do to manage a population that you have in prison. And punishment plays great with voters. I'm not denying that, but then you've got, I mean, we have two DOJ reports detailing some truly horrific conditions in our state prisons. At some point we have to pull back and ask ourselves, like, what are we doing to resolve those issues?
So Erin, we're gonna break for spring break. Hopefully you get a little bit of time off. Hopefully you both do. I'd like some. we're going to come back on April 4th. They're talking about economic incentives. Is that what you're hearing in terms of what they are going to tackle when they get back?
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of economic incentives, at least 4 separate pieces of legislation in the House. They don't really know who's going to carry what yet, but it's related to jobs, small businesses, military even incentives. I've heard that. So that's definitely, populations that they always really want to help. It seems like, boosting the economy in Alabama has been a big theme since I've started reporting in the State House. So it was no surprise when I asked the Speaker and he said that is what they're going to focus on and probably get through within that first week they get back.
Mm-hmm. We've got to renew them, right, or else they expire, right? But they're going to revise them, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this will not be a hard lift for anybody. In fact, I believe House Minority Leader Anthony Daniels has been mentioned as one of the potential sponsors of that legislation. If you can get 2 parties working on that should go pretty quickly.
It is interesting on some of those big ticket items because, we observe Washington, we observe Congress, and it's just they can't get along on just about anything. But here they do a lot together. It's a pretty big contrast. And we'll see. We'll see. Not yet.
When a social issue comes up, I think we're going to see those fault lines.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Spoke too soon. Well, look, we're out of time, but thanks so much for coming on the show.
Okay, our pleasure. Thanks so much.
We'll be right back.
Madame Octavia Walton Levert was a 19th century socialite and writer known as the Pride of Mobile. She hosted lavish parties at her home for Mobile society, political figures, and luminaries from across the nation. She was appointed by the governor as the state's commissioner to the Paris Exposition in 1855 and gained national success for her travelogue, Souvenirs of Travel. She was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 1990.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching. As I mentioned earlier, the legislature will be on spring break next week, so we won't have nightly shows. We'll return next Friday night at 7:30 right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.